In this lecture, we will look at some of the ways that tests and assessments can be used in the counseling process. In previous weeks, we've looked at the difference between testing and assessment. And I'd like to reiterate that and go over the differences one more time so that we're fully clear on what assessment practices entail. In general, assessment is a process. It's used to define any method, technique, or intervention we can use to measure characteristics of people, programs, or subjects. In stating that it's a process, we look at it as being more than just a singular event. It is an ongoing activity. The assessment process allows us to take information that we gather from multiple sources and piece it together to come up with a more global or composite look at who our client is and what problems that individual may be facing. It's for this reason that assessment becomes really the most important activity we do as counselors. The gathering of information is what allows us to properly and effectively treat our clients. So why do we assess? Well, the assessment practice has many different purposes and allows us to collect information about clients. That information can then be tested to determine whether it's reliable, valid, or even relevant to the situation at hand. Useful information is then expanded and used in treatment planning. Gaps or holes in our understanding of the client can then be identified and filled with attempts to gain additional information. And so this assessment process continues throughout the course of our work with clients. We could see evidence of assessment practice in all different aspects of the counseling relationship. Whether we are screening new or prospective clients, diagnosing those clients we've been working with, planning treatments or identifying goals to work on as part of that treatment, and evaluating our client's progress, documenting areas of success and areas where additional work or focus may be required. So let's take a look at each of these sections in a little more detail and just talk about the basic activities we would be doing in each of these areas. First, we have the screening stage. This is the first part of the counseling process. Screening is when you introduced to new clients. Our primary goal during the screening stage is to learn what the client's presenting problem is. In other words, what is the reason that that individual is seeking counseling services at this time? What's going on that caused them to present for help? It's also a great way to understand the current functioning of the problem. More than likely, this problem is not something that developed overnight. and it's an issue that your clients have probably been dealing with for quite some time. But why did they decide to come for help now? What was it about their current functioning that made them seek help? And so these are some of the questions you attempt to answer during the screening stage. Putting all of that information together, you develop a snapshot of what it is that's going on with your client. That snapshot represents our initial clinical hunch or hypothesis about the client's state of affairs and presenting problem. The odds are very good that that hypothesis you have will change as our relationship develops further with our clients and we learn more about what it is that's affecting their daily lives. Even though our initial hypothesis may ultimately be proven incorrect, it does provide us with a good starting point. There are some ethical issues that we need to consider when assessing during this screening phase. First and foremost, we need to keep in mind that counseling may be a scary proposition for many clients. Having to come and talk with a stranger, sharing very personal and intimate details about your life, could be quite anxiety-provoking for clients. They may be unsure of how to act, what to share, where to begin. So as we work with clients during this screening stage, realize that some of the behaviors we observe, some of the topics we discuss, may be more a product of anxiety and nervous energy than it is true actual functioning of that client. We also practice assessment during the diagnostic stage. It's during this part of the counseling process that we attempt to gain a deeper understanding of what's going on with our clients. During the screening stage, they share with us, many times in basic terms, what the problem is. But now we could begin to go a little bit further, exploring that problem, trying to figure out different characteristics of it, such as its duration, its frequency, its intensity. During the diagnostic phase, we're trying to build a stronger framework. That initial hypothesis we had is tested and validated. Parts that hold true are expanded on and form the basis of future counseling interventions. The diagnostic stage also allows us to begin classifying or categorizing our clients' experiences. Documenting experienced symptoms or signs allow us to begin labeling and seeing if clients meet criteria for various mental health disorders. These disorders are listed in the DSM. Our assessment activities here are to determine whether or not clients meet diagnostic criteria for any of these various disorders. Like before, there's also some ethical issues to consider during the diagnostic phase. What do we do with clients who may not need full diagnostic criteria? For example, a client would need to meet 5 of the 9 existing criteria for depression to be diagnosed as depressed. What if, on the other hand, that client had 3 or 4 symptoms? Should we negate that client's lived experiences, telling them that they are, in fact, not depressed because criteria states otherwise? So there's a fine line we work between looking at clients' lived experiences and whether or not they meet some structured criteria for an experience or condition. We also look at assessment occurring during the treatment planning or goal identification stages. This is really where the rubber meets the road in the counseling process. Here we develop an action plan to try to counter the effect or solve whatever problem or issue the client has. These action plans are designed based on any identified or diagnosed disorders a client may have. Of diagnosis of bipolar disorder will result in a different treatment plan or action plan than a diagnosis of dementia. When we consider potential treatment plans for a client, we need to be holistic in our viewpoint. We need to take into account where the client has been in the past and where they want to go in the future to truly understand what's best for the client. Suggesting a treatment plan that the client has already tried and had limited success with would really waste valuable clinical time together. Furthermore, knowing where we want to go in the future helps establish an endpoint. Once we have an endpoint or a result, we could build a game plan designed to help us get there. In establishing goals, it's better to allow the client to participate in the process. Clients who co-construct their goals with their counselor are more likely to work towards goal achievement. When the individual has a vested interest in seeing a goal accomplished, they work harder. It's easier to work harder when you're working toward or for something of value to you. When individuals work together, it also expands the possibilities or ideas they may have for what effective treatment may look like. Ethically, it's important to remember when you set goals and treatment plans that all clients are different. They're all unique in their own way. static treatment plans that are a one-size-fits-all variety are generally not the best option. Individual differences need to be considered when establishing treatment plans and setting goals. We also could look at progress evaluation as being another area in which assessment plays a prominent role. Here's where we determine whether the work we're doing with the client is working or not. Are we successful, and is the client meeting those goals that were determined? If they are, we want to continue doing what we were doing that worked so well. If not, we may need to take a step back and attempt a new approach. There are several ways that you could evaluate progress. Two such ways are formative and summative evaluations. A summative evaluation is when you evaluate the entire project once it's completed. The basis for your evaluation is on finished product or end result. A formative evaluation evaluates the process and the development along the way of meeting that goal. There are pros and cons to both of these approaches. A summative approach or evaluation method allows you to see overall, was it successful? What it doesn't show you is perhaps what elements of the plan were most successful. Perhaps there were elements of your treatment plan that were invaluable and accounted for the biggest change in the client, whereas others had a very small effect and may not need to be used again. At times, this all or nothing approach negates the work and effort clients put into treatment. In these cases, the formative evaluation is preferred because it looks at the steps along the way, the effort put in. While that effort may not always result in tangible results, the work can still be documented and accounted for. For example, you could set out to lose weight and have a goal of losing 10 pounds in 1 month. Using a summative evaluation, you would evaluate at the end of the month, have the client get on the scale. If 10 pounds was lost, it was a success. If not, it was deemed unsuccessful. The formative evaluation looks at progress along the way or effort put into it. For one reason or another, maybe weight loss was not reflected in the scales, but you did change eating habits, began exercising more, and noticed an increase in energy and overall mood. by these definitions, your efforts would have been successful. Had we just used the summative single criterion method, they would not have been successful. So assessment is very multidimensional and can be used in a number of different areas or places of the counseling relationship. As we discussed, tests are one type of assessment that you could use. People also use the term synonymously, but that's not necessarily the case. Testing is not the same thing as assessment. Testing is not the same as appraisal. It's a component of those activities, one type of manifestation of those activities. If we were to define testing, we could look at testing as being the administration of a specific set of questions to individuals or groups of people for the express purpose of obtaining measurable scores on a group of constructs. Overall, the general public has a negative perception of tests. They are seen as difficult, challenging, not very reliable or accurate, and generally misleading. While it's true, some misuses of tests have created a need for clients to be concerned about the process, but when implemented in an effective, ethical, and professional manner, tests can be a great addition to the counseling process. In choosing whether to use tests in the counseling process, there are a number of questions you should ask yourself. First and foremost, what's the decision or judgment that's needed? As the counselor, what is my end game? What am I responsible for doing? Based on what needs to happen or occur as a result of my assessment activities, I could choose accordingly with the method that makes the most sense. Second, I want to list the information I need to make that decision or judgment. If I want to diagnose you as having major depression, then there are 9 different symptoms and criteria that I need to collect information on to determine whether or not they are present and accounted for in your living situation. I then want to look and see what information is already available. You certainly do not need to reinvent the wheel. If information already exists, we can incorporate that into our assessment process. If you work in the schools and you're doing intelligence or achievement testing, there may be standardized test results already in the child's academic record that can be used as a measure and thus prevent you from having to test the child again. When information is already available, and assuming that there are no expected changes in the individual's performance, we could just use that existing information. We then want to look at how the information should be obtained. Is it best to gather information directly from the client? Or would we be better off getting it from an outside source, such as a parent, a teacher? You can then look at the instrument or method you want to use to gather the information. Are we looking at an individual test, a group test, standardized, projective tests? Several different options are available to you. And then finally, how should the results be evaluated? How will they be discussed and integrated into the decisions and the conceptualization you have of the client? Ideally, they play a role, but do not serve as the sole source of information for all decisions you make about a client. So as you begin to see how assessment and testing plays an important role in the counseling process, and the importance of selecting the most appropriate tests to use, we should look at identifying areas that you could refer to in gathering information about tests. In other words, where would you go to determine what the most effective tests are for your given need with your clients? One source is the Mental Measurements Yearbook. The Mental Measurements Yearbook is a reference guide that chronicles the development of all new instruments, regardless of whether they are measuring psychological, intellectual, relational, or interpersonal dynamics in a client. The Mental Measurements Yearbook is published by the Burroughs Institute at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Oscar Burroughs is a former faculty member at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In the 1930s, he established this system of chronicling assessments so that other professionals could access these resources and make informed decisions on which tests would be most beneficial for them. The manual came out periodically, and we're currently on the 18th edition of the yearbook. That 18th edition came out in 2010. A new version, the 2014 edition, which would be the 19th version, is scheduled to be on the market early next year. A wealth of information is included in each entry for each test. Reviews, similar to what you'll be conducting in this class, are published for various tests. These reviews contain information that talk about how tests should be applied and used, the qualifications required to use the test, how it is scored, how results can be applied to the counseling process. While there is a set format for test reviews, some are more detailed than others. To be included in the Mental Measurements Yearbook, a test or instrument has to have 3 criteria met. One, the test must be commercially available. It's a test that is marketed and that can be purchased for use. Excluded from this yearbook are tests that are created by individual researchers either for their own practice or disseminated in research, but with no plans to commercialize their instrument. Tests must also be published in the English language. Foreign versions are not included in the Mental Measurements Yearbook. And thirdly, revisions of previously published tests can appear in the yearbook so long as the revisions are significant, meaning structural changes, addition or subtraction of test items, changing of scales. In total, there are over 4,000 tests that have been cataloged and reviewed in the 18 versions of the Mental Measurements Yearbook since its inception. There are several different ways that you could access these items. You can check the yearbook, out of the library. Hard copies are available for you to thumb through and leaf through. You also can look at electronic format. The library subscribes to the Mental Measurements Yearbook database. All 4,000 plus test reviews are available online for you to access. Additional resources include tests in print. This is another book published by the Burroughs Institute. It's a listing of all commercially available English language tests. It's a running total, so the list is cumulative. Each subsequent edition just adds to that list, or in some cases subtracts if an item goes out of press or is no longer used or created. What separates tests in print from the Mental Measurements Yearbook is that there are no reviews of the test. It simply is a listing of what's out there and what's available. It's up to counselors individually to determine whether or not this instrument is best for you given your client population, or if another may be more beneficial. A third option is the book Tests. And a fourth option is the book Test Critiques. These are similar to the Mental Measurements Yearbook and Tests in Print, except they are published by ProEd, a test publishing company located in Texas. Tests includes over 3,500 test reviews. The information here is brief. It's a simple synopsis of the review, as well as the contact and ordering information for the test. Individuals who want more than just that brief synopsis can look in Test Critiques. Test Critiques contains the entire full version review of the test. Both of these items can be used in situations where counselors may not have access to any of the Bureau's material, such as the Mental Measurements Yearbook or Tests in Print. The entries in test follow a consistent format. Here's an outline of what entries in test look like. They describe the test title, listing the author's name, copyright information, information about the publisher, it talks about populations for which a test should be used. Included is information about the norming sample so that you can see if a test may be relevant for you. Scoring methods and interpretive suggestions are also available for you. So these options are all hardcover books available. Internet resources are also available. I mentioned the Mental Measurements Yearbook available through the library. You also could access reviews by going to the Bureau's website, as they have an online database of all of their reviews. For $15, an individual can purchase an individual review. That review that you purchase is delivered to you instantly. And so it could be helpful when you need information quick and fast and are not around other resources, such as the manuals or yearbooks. Another site you could look at are the websites of the test publishers themselves. Most websites include descriptions of the tests that they're selling. They could be brief, a paragraph or less, or they could be more advanced, sometimes as a downloadable file that talks about the test and its development. Information obtained from these sources can be used to supplement additional information you gather and help you make an informed decision as to whether or not a test should be used. Another source that most people overlook, but I find to be a very valuable source, are professional journals. counselors could look in their journals and see what other tests are being used by their colleagues. The tests that are being used often have a significant body of research and literature behind it. As a result, they're very strongly based in the literature. They have evidence documenting their effectiveness. The plus of these are that instruments can be had either royalty-free or at a minimal cost. The other manuals in the yearbooks talked about commercially available tests, meaning you had to contact a test publisher and purchase the test. This could be quite an expensive proposition. Many of the tests that you see documented in the journals are free. They may be in the free public domain, or you simply may need to just contact the author and get written permission to use their test. Most authors are very willing to share their instrument with you because it helps build their database on the test. These are also the best source of current information. Journal articles are coming out on a regular basis. They represent cutting-edge research in our profession. The current version of the Mental Measurements Yearbook was published in 2010. Reviews in that were probably conducted in 2008 or 9. So many years have gone by since those reviews. There may be a change or more current instruments that provide better services to you. As we select an instrument, there are several things that we need to look at. Most of these are included in the test reviews. The key becomes knowing how to interpret the information. First, we look at the test purpose. What is the instrument designed to measure? Is it an intelligence instrument? Is it a personality measure? Does it assess criteria for depression or anxiety? When measuring ambiguous constructs such as intelligence, happiness, excitement, we want to look and see how those constructs are defined. What are the operational definitions? Do the operational definitions presented by the test authors align with how I am operationally defining the variable and how it plays out in my clients' lives? Second, we want to know what the information we get tells us about our client. If the instrument just screens for symptoms and says whether or not they meet criteria, I may already know that information. I may be more interested in the severity. Finally, is that instrument one that's used to predict the future or explain current functioning? If it predicts the future, it allows us time to begin implementing a treatment strategy or approach designed to maximize future success. We next want to look and see how the instrument was developed. What was the process through which test authors went in building their instrument? How did they get their test items? Were they pulled from previous research? Were they field tested? Actually applied in certain settings? Or were they originated as the result of a survey of content experts? If I was interested in a construct from which I had no personal experience, I could consult with experts in the field and ask them to review my instrument and see if the items I include truly are relevant and predictive of that behavior or that construct. You also want to determine whether or not your instrument is based on a theoretical model or not. Theoretical-based assessment instruments are becoming more popular. Unfortunately, they're also very difficult to do. We'll talk a little bit more about those in the coming weeks. The difference between theory-based and practice-based tests. We also want to look at the norming group. The norm group is that initial sample of participants that were used to establish baselines, cut scores, measures of central tendency or variability such as a mean, or medians, or standard deviations. Who comprised the norm group? Was it a small group of children? A large group? Does the norm group match the population with whom I'm working? If our match is strong, then the likelihood of this being an effective instrument to use is greater. If the match is very weak, then the information I gain from testing may not be very valuable. It may not apply to the population of clients that I'm working with. So, for example, if an instrument, a problem behavior checklist, which is normed for children between the grades of kindergarten and 6th grade, and I'm working with 8th grade students, it may not be a good instrument for me to use. It may not be one that has much information or research behind it into how well it works with that older age group. When reviewing potential tests, we also want to pay attention to how that norm group was selected. How rigorous was the sampling method? Was it a random sample? Was it a cluster sample? Or perhaps it was just a convenience sample? Next, we want to consider user qualifications. Not everybody can use all tests. In fact, the testing market is very regulated as to who can and cannot use testing instruments. In the ACA Code of Ethics, it's expressly written that counselors only use assessments for which they have been duly trained and are qualified to administer and interpret. Just because you want to use a test doesn't mean you can. There are 3 basic qualification levels, and these may vary in name with the distant publishing companies. Each company establishes their criteria for tests. A level A test, you may also see as a level 1 test or a beginner test, can be used by anyone in the profession. The training required to use a level A test is simply reading the test manual. Counselors, case managers, clerical staff or support staff, parents, teachers, after-school workers could all administer level A tests once they have read and understand the test manual. A step up is a level B test. Level B tests require some graduate training on basic assessment principles and testing protocol. Your master's degree and the coursework in testing and assessment that you complete as part of that degree will qualify you at the B level. And then finally, there are level C tests. A level C test requires advanced training and education. Doctorate degrees are required. Sometimes it's even prescribed in what areas, such as a doctorate in psychology. Additional training may also be required. Coursework specific in that test. An example of a level C test would be the Rorschach ink blot test. An example of a level B test would be the Myers-Briggs type indicator. An example of a level A test would be a Beck depression screening inventory. As you review instruments, make sure you're selecting instruments for which you'll be qualified to use. We also want to consider practical issues involved with the test. How long is the test? How much does it cost? Is it available? All are considerations we need to take into account. For example, the MMPI takes an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete. You may work in a facility where you only have 50-minute sessions to see clients. And so this test is not very practical. The cost also factors in. Intelligence testing costs between $800 and $1,200. Not every individual can afford to have this type of testing done. And finally, we look at some licensing agreements. Some of you may work at facilities or agencies that have licensing agreements in place, whereby they are contractually obligated to only use certain types of tests. You should check with your supervisors to determine whether or not there are any restrictions, and if there are, what are the tests that you need to be using. Once we've made a decision on a test and we're ready to implement it in the process, we first need to do some behind-the-scenes prep work. Before you administer the test, you need to familiarize yourself with the test and the manual. You should have a strong understanding of what the test is and what it measures. Reading over the manual ensures that you fully understand the standardized administration protocol. We also need to ensure that the testing facility is adequate and free from distraction. Will individuals be able to concentrate, focus on their work in a quiet, comfortable setting? We then need to work with clients to help ease their anxiety. As I mentioned earlier, many clients may have a negative perception of testing. This is something that develops early in life. Even in school, students are not fans of tests. So helping the client to see how this test is going to be used and beneficial to them is a great way to build rapport and reduce anxiety. Finally, you want to gain informed consent. Prior to initiating the testing process, clients should be able to give you informed consent. In other words, they should be well informed about the test and what's about to happen so that they could agree in good conscience with participating in this process. There are many elements that go into informed consent. Here are some of the things that you'd want to talk about. It's helpful if you think of the informed consent process similar to the process you go through when buying a car. As you research different cars and before you buy a car, what do you look for? What types of information do you need to make the best decision? What questions would you have? Trying to anticipate the questions you think your clients would have allows you to give proper information needed for informed consent. At the end of your presentation, the client should fully understand what it is that they're about to do and what's expected of them. You also have responsibilities during the test. You need to make sure that all the items are available and distributed to the clients. Making sure that all forms are in place. Clients have the correct utilities, whether it's a pencil, extra paper, calculators. You also need to make sure that you're following the standardized administration protocol exactly. Deviations from this could potentially invalidate test results. You also want to ensure that you're addressing any special accommodation needs of your clients. Those who have documented disabilities that may require assistance and accommodations, whether it be additional testing time, larger print test booklets, better lighting, quieter test location. Make sure that all of these are available to ensure the smooth transition throughout the testing process. And finally, you want to answer any questions before the testing begins. Some tests are very prescriptive about your ability to answer questions, what you can answer and when you can answer it. Make sure you're following the directions and administration of the test and handling client questions appropriately. Some additional problems you may note during administration. These are things that you probably want to think about how you will address. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Cheating. How will you handle cheating? How will you address questions clients may have that are not in the manual? What about clients who are guessing or not really invested in the process? How do we try to prevent distractions? All of these are issues to consider. And then finally, after the administration of the test, our responsibilities include collecting all the materials and safely securing them or storing them. Because of copyright laws, many tests need to be closely monitored and regulated. Information cannot be available to the general public. As a counselor, you're also responsible for scoring the instrument and preparing the report, as well as debriefing the client. After the test, it's usually a good practice to spend a few moments talking with the client, getting their feedback. What was the testing process like? Did they find it easy or difficult? Were there parts of the test that they did not understand or found challenging? You also could use any disclosure here to talk about any deception should it have occurred. Sometimes your assessment activities need to be concealed. When the client is aware that you're observing or assessing, it may bias their results. For example, doing a behavioral observation of a child in a school. It may be beneficial for you to not alert to the child that you're observing them. After the time is over, though, you should disclose what actually was taking place. Collectively, all these responsibilities fall under what we call test management. Test management begins the moment we select or decide on a test and continues all the way through the conclusion of the test, the writing of the report, and presenting of the results to the client. Depending on the test that you use, test management may look very different. In fact, some publishing companies have specific requirements that you're asked to sign on with before they'll let you use their tests. This means that you have to agree that you will maintain the integrity of the test and follow all of their exact rules and regulations in exchange for permission to use the test. Some stipulations to consider. In addition to maintaining test security, try to avoid labeling people based on a single score. Intelligence is not defined as your simple raw IQ score. We need to look at it in context, Consider other variables. Collaborate with other individuals, such as teachers, parents, compared to other pieces of data we may have. You want to make sure that you adhere to copyright laws, that you're not plagiarizing or illegally using test instruments. You want to make sure that you're following the manual guidelines in using the test in the appropriate manner, and that you're sharing results with authorized individuals. When debriefing clients, make sure that you use appropriate language. Technical language that you and other professionals would understand may not be language that clients understand. So put it in their language. Also consider the age of your client. When working with children, use terminology that children would understand. You also want to put results in context. Again, these results did not occur in a vacuum or in isolation. What do they mean in terms of the overall picture of who this client is? And finally, share with the client limitations of both the test and the assessment process. What are some factors that may limit the validity of these results? Remember, no test is perfect. No test predicts 100% of the variance or reasons why a client acts or behaves the way they do. They all have their limitations, and these should be shared with the client. In terms of scoring and interpreting the test, you need to think about how you're going to score the test. Will it be hand scored? Is it self-scored? Can the client score it themselves? Maybe it's optic scanned. You have a bubble sheet and it's fed through a Scantron reader. Or maybe it's computer scored. A growing number of tests are using computer scoring. The benefit of the computer scoring is that you receive a large printout, interpretive or evaluative report about the individual. You also want to talk about how you're going to share the results with the client. Perhaps you prepare a report or a test book and give to the client for them to read on their own. Or perhaps you'll discuss in session with the client, going over each bit of information piece by piece, giving the client a chance to offer some more qualitative information. They may share with you that, well, the reason they got that score is because they were tired by that part of the test, or they didn't understand the directions. You also want to consider how scores should be interpreted. Were they criterion referenced? In other words, is there a set score or performance level marker that they needed to meet? For example, a 70% pass rate. For you to pass a test, you need to score at least 70%. That's a criterion. There are two different types of criterion reference tests: authentic and alternative assessments. Authentic assessments are when you evaluate the client performing a particular skill or ability in its native environment. Alternative assessment is when we use a contrived or clinical environment. An example of an authentic assessment would be if I wanted to monitor your interpersonal skills or rate your interpersonal skills, and I followed you around for a day or a week and saw how you interacted with people in your day-to-day living. Alternative assessment is contrived and set up in a research environment. For example, you can go to the doctor and they can give you a stress test. The stress test is designed to determine the amount of exertion put on your heart. On the stress test, they make you run a treadmill in the office. This is an alternative assessment. We also look to see if the scores are single skill or multiple skill scores. Your IQ score is a multiple skill score. There are different types of intelligences that are measured in an IQ test. The score you get on individual subscales could be a single skill score. We talk about the accuracy of the scores and the retention. How long are these scores valid for? Will an individual need to be reassessed in the near future or distant future to get a more accurate understanding of performance and functioning at that time? Sometimes we use norm-referenced tests. A norm-reference test is where your performance is evaluated or compared against a developmental sample. How other people of like ability, age, and other demographics perform. Are you the typical graduate student? Do you perform better or worse than graduate students? There are several different types of norm-referenced scores. To get a norm-reference score, we need to standardize them. Standard scores allow us to make comparisons between individuals. There's a process for taking raw scores and standardizing them. Most test manuals or scoring booklets include directions for calculating standard scores. Percentiles. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with percentiles. It represents the percentage of individuals that scored at or below you on a national distribution. A variation of a percentile is the NCE, the normal curve equivalent. It's a way to standardize percentiles that it allows for averaging. If you were at the 50th percentile on one test, the 70th percentile on a second administration, and then the 24th percentile on a third, we could average those together had we used a normal curve equivalent. In terms of standard scores, the most common are Z-scores and T-scores. A Z-score is a standard score where the distribution of the population is set with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, meaning the average score is 0, and we can go out standard deviation units both positively and negatively by a unit of 1. For a t-score, the mean, is 50, and each standard deviation is 10. A final standard deviation, or standard score you may see, is a stay-9. Stay-9s were actually created by the military for use in military settings, and it means standard 9. A percentile divides the distribution up into 100 equal parts. Stay-9s divide the distribution up into 9 equal parts. An individual's placement is then determined in which 9/4 interval you fall in. So how do these standard scores help us? Well, they all play off of something called the normal curve. In research, we talk about the normal curve being the expected distribution of scores with sufficient numbers. So in other words, if I were to test everyone in the country on any type of measure with a sample size that large in the hundreds of millions of people, I would expect scores to fall along a distribution that looked like this. The majority of people are clustered in the middle, average, and then decreasing amounts of people who did exceptionally well and exceptionally poor. This is where we get such concepts as regression to the mean and the normalizing of a population. Most people will score average. If you look at the bottom, you'll note 0 is in the middle. Standard scores, or the normal curve, is based on the z distribution. That mean in the middle, and then we could go out intervals of 1 each way. A standard deviation unit of +1, +2, +3, and similarly on the negative side, going at decreasing values of 1, -1, -2, -3. These standard deviation units theoretically can go out forever. There is no end to them. Practically, however, we rarely, if ever, see scores above 3 or 4 standard deviation units away from the mean. Because this normal curve holds true for all populations, there are some properties that are constant. They will not change from distribution to distribution. On a normal curve between the mean and 1 standard deviation, we could expect to find a little over 34% of the scores in a distribution. Between 1 and 2 standard deviation units, we could expect to find 13.59%. And then above 2, we could expect to find 2.25%. Those same percentages fall on the negative side as well. A normal curve is equivalent. If you were to fold it in half, those sections would be the same. The percentage of scores between 0 and -1 would also be 34.13%. Between -1 and -2, 13.59%. And beyond -2, 2.28%. Those numbers can allow you now to make a number of different estimations about a population. For example, I could ask you what percentage of scores would be between -1 and +1 standard deviations. Well, you know that each of those sections has 34%. You could add the two together and tell me about 68%. I could ask you between +2 and -2 standard deviation units, and you could tell me about 95% of the population. Taking it a step further, you could also now tell me about numbers of people. If there are 100 people in the class, how many of them would we expect to fall between -1 and +1 standard deviations? Well, we know it's about 68%. So 68% of those 100 students would be 68 students. So the use of standardized scores is important in assessment. It's what allows us to compare individuals to one another. As we collect data and scores on individuals, there are several factors we need to take into consideration. Was the individual motivated to take the test? Were they coached? Were they trying to respond in a way that presented themselves more favorably? Was the situation adequate for the testing needs? What types of questions? Some people are not good test takers with multiple choice. Others don't like essays. So all of these are factors we need to consider when evaluating test scores. We also should take into account whether there was any test bias. Certain tests may have inherent biases to particular populations. Reviewing the test manual will give you information on populations for which this test has been normed and those for which no normative data is available. Many of the ethical and legal issues we talk about stem from inappropriate use of tests with populations in which a bias occurs, whether it be a gender bias, a racial bias, an age bias. We also should make sure we account for examiner bias. What is it about you, the counselor, that may skew the results? This has a lot to do with who you are, your beliefs and cognitions, and also the relationship you have with the client. Whether it's a strong relationship or is it one in which the client doesn't trust you very well and thus may not be motivated to work strongly on the test? We also take into account any expectancy effects. One that you'll see noted a lot is the Rosenthal effect. It talks about your expectations affecting their performance. If you have a child that you constantly praise as being smart child, smart child, smart child, smart child, they're more likely to view themselves as smart. They'll study more and perform better on tests because they want to live up to your expectation of them. This can play out in counseling in a number of different ways. A client may pick up on the fact whether or not you're truly invested in their success or not. When you are, they put forth more effort. When you are not, they take on that mindset and they themselves are not invested in the process. We also try to make sure we don't commit any common testing errors. One such error is to seek confirmatory evidence. I may have a hypothesis I develop about you from our initial intake or first few sessions. And so I'm only looking for evidence that confirms what I already believe. I may neglect, either consciously or subconsciously, other pieces of information that may contradict what I think. I may have a tendency for looking at patterns, trying to make connections between isolated events when really a connection may not exist. And thirdly, I may have some preconceived biases. I may view you as a troublemaker. I may have heard from other faculty members that you're a disruptive student. And so I go in with this mindset and start assessing. Anything that happens that confirms this stands out. And so as we assess clients, we want to try to do so from a neutral perspective. Not going into the process already having made up our minds about who this individual is and what their issues may be. And lastly, but no less important, we want to make sure that we gather feedback from the clients. Feedback allows us to improve the process in the future. Have clients share with you what they thought about the test itself, what they thought about the administration process. Perhaps the room was too cold, or they needed more light, or more time would have been helpful. Knowing what works and what doesn't work allows us to fine-tune the process. So now we've covered several different ways that tests can be utilized in the counseling process. In fact, we probably only really scratched the surface, as assessments, formal or informal, standardized and unstandardized, have several applications and great utility for your work as a counselor.